In part 1 of this video series, I took a look at how Nobuo Uematsu systematically constructed 2 of the themes from Final Fantasy VI, analyzing how each grew out of the careful development of just 1 or 2 motifs. This process I laid out can be a little hamstrung by the context that Uematsu was working in at the time. Video game tunes in this era mostly had to be pretty short and infinitely repeatable, and there's a limit to how much you can develop a musical idea in such a small amount of time, especially in a way that allows you to loop back to the beginning of the piece without sounding unnatural. Fortunately for us, we can look elsewhere in the soundtrack to find ideas established in previous tunes elaborated on in new and exciting ways. That's right, folks, I'm talking about leitmotifs! Take the brothers Edgar and Sabin's theme. This piece shares a lot of structural similarities with Terra's theme, which we looked at last time. It's structured in AAB form, using 8-bar phrases, moving between the minor key and its relative major key, and it even opens with another 3-note melodic motif that informs the rest of the composition, albeit less directly than in our first example. The motif in question is this regal-sounding figure where the 5th of the chord jumps up to the flat 7th, then steps down to the raised 6th, harmonized with our tonic C-sharp minor chord moving to an F-sharp major chord. Following this is a drop down to an F-sharp, followed by 2 repetitions of this phrase shortened into 8th notes to fit inside 1 bar. This is such a cool melody. The first 2 notes act as an enclosure of the 3rd note, which itself starts off another melodic enclosure of the 1st note of the 2nd bar, which once again starts off the enclosure of this A sharp and on and on. This winding, twisty pattern speeds up rhythmically from quarter notes to 8th notes to a 16th note triplet, creating this crescendo of melodic tension that gets released in the following legato phrase. This phrase complements the first perfectly, releasing the twisty, staccato C-sharp minor tension with a smooth legato phrase harmonized with a 4-5-1 cadence in the relative major key of E. Again, we see an example of repetition with minimal variation to great melodic effect. Uematsu repeats this 4-bar phrase note for note until the very end, where these last 3 notes are traded in for a 3-note enclosure of our tonic C-sharp that once again mirrors the initial motif that kicked off the beginning of the piece. There's a lot going on here structurally. Melodically speaking, the 5th of the key generally creates momentum because it feels unresolved, whereas the tonic feels nice and resolved and usually signals the end of a tune or section. So having the first phrase end on the 5th while the second phrase ends on the tonic makes for a very satisfying 8 bars of music, especially when the way that we approach the final tonic in this 3rd down, 2nd up enclosure is a reflection of all the times in these 8 bars that we've approached the 5th of the key in the exact same way. Now, you might be a little disappointed seeing that there are about 2 bars in this whole section that aren't directly related to the 3-note motif that started us off. How could Uematsu drop the ball so hard, you might ask? Don't worry, an avid recycler, Uematsu makes sure to use this melodic idea as the basis for the B section of the piece. We start with a direct copy of the bar in question, with the following bars each copying the melodic contour but shifting it down to fit the underlying harmony before simply resolving to the tonic C-sharp. We see a similar harmonic flip to the one found in Terra's theme, where the A sections alternated between the C-sharp minor harmony and an E major resolution. The B section starts off with a cadence in E that gives way to a very classical flat 2-5-1 cadence in C-sharp minor. This phrase works as such a great complement to the A section because it is just dripping with ideas established in the A section, from the obvious recycling of this bar of melody right down to the major 6th that embellishes the C-sharp minor chord. But it also introduces new ideas, like the use of this flat 2 chord D. As Uematsu develops his initial musical ideas, these new ideas that pop up along the way are usually the ones that get picked up and elaborated on as he moves along in a piece of music, creating this chain of establishing musical ideas, repeating them with small variations, then taking one of the variations and crafting it into a new musical idea and repeating this process. We see this as the second half of the B section rudely interrupts its own repetition of the first half with this big horn fanfare on our flat 2 chord D, which turns into a D7 chord that sets up a stanky tritone subtype resolution back to the C sharp minor chord at the start of the tune. As I mentioned earlier, we can find Uematsu using certain themes and different tunes across the Final Fantasy VI soundtrack, putting melodies and motifs in new musical contexts and transforming them the same way that the characters or ideas that the motifs represent transform as they experience new situations and developments in the story. One scene in the game depicts Edgar and Sabin, the brothers whose theme we just analyzed, recalling the coin toss they used to decide who would take on the responsibility of ruling a corrupt kingdom and who would get to run away to a free life in the wilderness. The music scoring this scene, unceremoniously titled Coin Song on the English soundtrack album, cleverly weaves elements of Edgar and Sabin's theme into a more sentimental arrangement to capture the sentimental tone of the scene. The intro takes the first bar of the brothers' theme and completely changes the way it feels. Trading out the brass section for a solo electric piano and reharmonizing each chord with the relative major or minor counterpart turns the tune into something a lot more wistful than the original incarnation. This phrase is then repeated but altered, with the following bar maintaining the general contour of the line but changing the specifics in order to directly resolve to C sharp minor, by way of the same flat 2 5-7-1 cadence we saw introduced in the bridge of the original theme. What I love about this tune is that it almost feels like it picks up where the original theme leaves off. The A sections of Coin Song are a direct copy of the bridge to Edgar and Sabin's theme, simply stripped down to a simple keyboard arrangement. The only real difference occurs at the end of the section, where the extended D major fanfare is traded out for another flat 2 5-1 cadence, only this time with the classic Picardy third ending pulled from the A section of the original tune. It's after this section that Uematsu stops borrowing his old ideas and starts to develop this theme a little farther. He takes the short melodic idea used in the intro to Coin Song, the main motif around which the entire theme is built, and shifts it around a little by messing with the interval structure. Instead of the original's winding third up, second down, second up structure, this new melody reverses the first two intervals for a second up, third down, second up that resolves to the same targeted G-sharp note. This is actually kind of a hefty variation, and it's not so easy to hear the connection between these ideas without putting them right beside each other, but there are enough similarities to make this new phrase sound related to the earlier music on a deep level, feeling like a natural evolution of the music that came before it rather than a complete non sequitur. The cool thing about this section to me is that while this phrase does tie back to the original motif in this way, it also simultaneously establishes a brand new musical idea, an approach up of a second to an arpeggio of a triad. This melodic idea, which might just have been an unintended consequence of screwing around with the original motif, is what Uematsu decides to run with as he moves forward in the piece, and you can see this idea informing the entire B section of the tune. We see the same approach to arpeggio immediately follow the first, only this time the arpeggio ascends to contrast the initial descending F-sharp minor triad. We then see the same pattern used to outline a B minor chord, with the flat second scale degree another aspect that ties the section back to the music that came before it. The melody follows Uematsu's typical structured approach by repeating the first phrase again and changing out the second phrase for a new variation of the melodic idea, this time shortened from a 2-bar phrase into a 1-bar phrase that still maintains the approach into arpeggio motif at its core. This is echoed between the flute and the oboe through descending chords until we set up a return to the top with a big 4/5 move. I absolutely love this. If you put the original theme and coin song back to back, you can track the way Uematsu takes an idea, develops it into a melody, then takes one of the embellishments on this melody and isolates it as a new idea, then develops that, and so on and on and on. It's this chain of musical growth that keeps bringing us fresh new ideas that always tie back to where we started in a way that's just so inherently satisfying. And I think that this is partly why Uematsu's music is so powerful. I mentioned before the limitations composers had to work with in the 16-bit era, with the majority of video game music being less than 2 minutes long and written to loop endlessly. But as you may know, Uematsu was one of the pioneers who started to break away from these constrictions, going so far as to write an epic 18-minute long final boss theme for this very game. That's right, it's time to tackle Dancing Mad.